yourself. What I'm going to talk about now is, there it is, the historical context for Genesis. And I'm going to skip the first chapter altogether, and we're going to start with chapter 2 pretty much. Boker Tov, Shalom. I'm in the wrong language. This is Genesis. The Septuagint is where the name Genesis came from, up there on top. That's why we call it Genesis. It's a Greek word. It means beginning. Next slide. Okay, now I'm supposed to say Boker Tov, everybody. That's Bereshit. It's in the beginning in Hebrew. It's how the book starts in the title of the book of Genesis in Hebrew. People talk about the original Hebrew. This is Bereshit Baralim Het Shamim Eretz. It's Genesis 1:1 right down to Vayier Vayivoker Yom Echad down there at the bottom. This is not exactly the original language. Can I have the next slide here? This is an older version of Hebrew. This is Paleo Hebrew. You can find some of this in the Dead Sea, but even there it's pretty scarce. Next slide. Hebrew is the language of Israel. However, Genesis starts in Iraq. So we're dealing with something even older than Hebrew here. So next slide. Southeastern Iraq, it's the green area is called Sumer, actually. Next slide, please. And when archaeologists started digging there, this is the kind of writing they found. This is cuneiform. It's wedge writing. This is the Gilgamesh epic. It actually contains a variation of the story of Noah, right down to the doves and ravens and everything, and the 7 days between releasing animals, that kind of stuff. Pretty creepy similarities. However, it's much later than the Genesis record and has some variations. Next slide. There was no single Rosetta Stone. This is a Rosetta Stone that was used to translate hieroglyphics. For figuring out cuneiform, they had to go for a bunch of different sources, and it would be a long story. It would take the whole 45 minutes and more to explain how guys figured out how to read this stuff before. Next slide. But they did learn, and when they learned, the people called themselves the people from the land of Akkad, so we call the language Akkadian. When they learned how to read Akkadian, they discovered in the Akkadian documents that there had been another civilization that came earlier that was called Sumer. The people call themselves the black-headed people, or we call them Sumerians. Next one. And this is an example of their writing. It's also cuneiform. This particular thing is a list of critters. I don't know how to explain it. Something late in the 500 section in the library, different kinds of birds and things. The prism up in the upper left is it's a king's list. It has a list of different kings, how many years they ruled and things like that on it. Now, I have a laser pointer. I don't have to jump up there. This thing here is called a colophon. When you filled out your papers in elementary school, you put your name and the date up on the top. It's the same thing. It comes at the end of the document. This is read in this direction here, this particular tablet, though that's not typical for the more ancient Sumerian. I'll explain that later. What this contains is essentially the name and the date. Now, early Sumerian writings, people had no idea how to do a date. It was kind of experimental. They would try things. This was written the year the oak tree was planted out by the barn. And somebody digging through the tablets finds that and says, great. Later on, they would refer to the third year of the king Gilgamesh or something like that, and they started making sense. But for starters, you might get anything at all for a date and anything at all for a name. And this is going to make things tough on us. But anyway, that's what it's about. They also had sequencing information. If your tablet went for more than one block of clay, the next tablet down here would start with a reference back to the colophon. The first line would say some line kind of echoed from the colophon, so you'd know how to hook the pages together. Hadn't invented page numbers yet, so that was the best they could do. Next slide. This is what came before that kind of writing. This is pictographic writing. It's Sumerian there, for example. That means food. That's the symbol for barley. That's probably numbers. That may be the number 2, but it looks a little bit different later on, so I'm not sure about that. This thing here is the signature, an early version of a colophon made from a roller seal there. You can just barely see what's going on there. It wasn't very carefully done. These are translations of some Sumerian symbols. I referred to food there, and I think barley's on that. Down here at the bottom, which is how come I knew those two symbols. And a tracing from cuneiform back to the pictographs at the beginning. Next slide, please. This is an example of, I don't know what it would be called, an inventory probably. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 of these things. It looks like a diode or something, but I'm sure it wasn't. That's obviously a chocolate chip cookie and a cheese sandwich. This is the way they wrote, and this is how many of each of those things somebody had to do something with. It might have been a temple offering. It might have been anything. Later on, they came up with symbols for 10. Those might have been tens in the last thing, 60, 600. And these are the original pictographic symbols, and these here are the cuneiform versions for the symbols. Things I want to point out. The ideas are in blocks. It's read right to left on each line, unlike that one list of birds and things I showed you earlier. So, very repetitious. Number, something, something, something that we don't know what was. Earliest known writing. Looks like that next slide. Now this one I think is very interesting. This one they call a ration tablet. And the reason it's called a ration tablet, not only do we have this many cheese sandwiches and this many loaves of bread, etc. on each day, that thing looks sort of like food, but it's a little bit different. This symbol here is very interesting. That's the sun rising between mountains, and it means day. And that is the number 1. Day 1, day 2, day 3. Got it? Wow. So you recognize that from somewhere? And there's something repeated here. Nobody knows what these symbols mean. Something that looks like an oil well with a flag on it, and at somebody's head, a little thing for turning your sprinklers off. Things like that. It's all repeated, but nobody knows what it all means. There's a refrain that's repeated day 1, refrain that's repeated day 2. This is a literary style. Think about that literary style. Okay, I got everything on that slide. Next slide. And think about Genesis. Very repetitious, and God breathed, and God said, and God saw, and God divided, and God called. And there was evening and morning, day 1, literally. It's Yom Echad in the Hebrew, not the first day. Next slide, please, not next tablet. And there was evening, morning, day 2, day 3. Notice there's an arrow drawn backwards. Even the Sumeriologists get it backwards sometimes. It definitely goes 1, 2, 3, not 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And there's also a colophon. And you've heard a different story about this. I'm going to try to confuse you all by telling you that the word generations means something different than what you've heard earlier today. These are the generations. Look it up in a lexicon. It means something like birth. I'm going to throw out a kind of a halfway between what I think they really meant originally and the word birth. Brainchild, an idea. We're dealing with a primitive language. We don't have a lot of sophisticated words. I mean, this is the dawn of writing, after all, that this thing gets written at. And we've got to figure out some kind of word, and birth looks like the best way to say the idea of the heavens and the earth, name of some kind of owner. Very primitive. This is not going to get it back to Sammy when it gets graded, but it is about the heavens and the earth when they were created. Oh, look, there's the date. We've got all the elements of the colophon there at Genesis 2:4, indicating that this is the end of the tablet, that we're dealing with a tablet, and the next tablet begins here, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Generations, the heavens and the earth when they were created. It references back. So we know we're on the next tablet here, and we got the tablets in the right order. I think this is very interesting. Next slide. Here's some more colophons, another uses of the generations. This is the book. Now that's an interesting term. That means written record of the generations, or the idea of Adam. This time we're making a point of saying it's a written record. We're saying, hey guys, we're using the newfangled technology of writing here. Okay? We forget that later. It's no big deal anymore. It's not new stuff. But this one time it shows up as a written record. Yes, during Adam's time they were using writing. At least they claim to in the book. They're in the colophon on the book. The generations of Adam, the name of it, in the day that God created man. A unique date, but still a very crude one, and not going to be much help for archaeologists. Down here in 10:1, I skipped over a colophon in the middle that was pointed out. These are the generations, colophon idea of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's probably 3 names, possibly a 4th one, depending on how you decide to count it. And unto them were born sons after the flood, a unique date. We got a date again. The sons, this is the next tablet, the sons of Japheth, were Gomer, Magog, the sequencing clue, and then later they'll have Shem and Ham down in the text. But anyway, these were other tablets that were ordered afterward. Next slide, please. What language did Adam speak? Well, there's some clues. Genesis 2:23 and Genesis 3:20. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman." And there's the Hebrew, Aleph, Shem, He. to found to heal, because she was taken out of man. We know what Adam named his wife there. And Adam called his wife's name Eve. What is that? A tov, a vav, and a he again? Very different. Breath, life, zoe. Now, where'd they get Eve? If it were Greek, it would be zoe. And this is something like tai, may have been where Lahayim came from or something, I'm not sure. This is very primitive anyway, because she was mother of all the living. Now you look at that and you say, why does he name his wife two different things? Why are they completely different? Why is there no connection? Until you pull out your Sumerian dictionary and you look up the word ti, which means both rib and life. It's a pun in Sumerian. It all works. In the language of Sumer, doesn't work in Hebrew. I have no idea where we got the modern word Eve. Got thrown in for free somewhere. Next slide. Okay, where was the Garden of Eden? Well, it's eastward in Eden, right? That'll help us a lot. There's a river that parts into four heads, and the names of them, and of course the Tigris and Euphrates are there. Next slide. Now here, that looks like a stain on a monastery floor. In fact, it's an aerial view of Iraq. And you can see some rivers there, and the whole thing is really flat, which is why it looks like a stain. And the rivers meander. You can see all the little wiggles there all over the place. They don't stay put from millennia to millennia. Next word, eastward in Eden. Okay, we pull out our Sumerian lexicon again and we look up the word Eden, which is in there. It's a steep, plain desert, grazing land between the two long rivers, back, spine, upper side, chest, thorax, shack, etc., etc. That's Eden, right there. We're not guessing. It's the dictionary definition for the people who wrote this. Next slide. Okay, here's Eden. Now, these are ancient cities. The little dots, Basra and Baghdad, are modern cities. They're square. But the ancient ones show where the rivers used to be. I told you they meandered. They meandered a lot. Those cities are all high and dry out in the middle of the desert now with no water. We got a third river coming into a common head here from out where these cities were. And we got something going on over here that's not on the Euphrates. So there's a place for a fourth river to come in and water those cities. Okay, modern silting, since these cities were built, filled in this area. It's like a river delta, except it goes into a gulf here, so it fills it in solid. So there's no ancient cities here because there was no land there to build them on. Next slide. Okay, the Chaldees, referring about Abram and Terah. There's an there. He may have been from a different I don't know, but anyway, it's a possible link. Next slide. And Eridu. Eridu is very interesting. It's the world's oldest city. It's believed it's at least the oldest city in ancient Sumer and probably the very oldest. There's high and dry in the middle of the desert. The ruins are digging up, trying to figure out what was there. Very little writing there. This would have probably been too early for much writing. Writing was a later invention, or maybe not too much later, and only a few people had it. Maybe there were some books there, but they can't find them now. Next page, next tablet, next slide. When did it happen? Well, we can go through our genealogies in Genesis chapter 5, Genesis chapter 11, which takes us down to, that would have been about Nahor or Terah or somewhere. Genesis chapter 11. And these probably aren't going to be much help. Methuselah, there's 969 years, Adam 930 years that they lived. Something seems fishy about the dates for some reason. Not only did Adam live past his great-great-great-grandsons, but here we got some people that die after their great-great-great-grandsons are born or died too. And we suspect something here. We don't know what to suspect quite yet, but let's see if we can figure that out. Continue to the next slide. The Sumerian Kings List, that's that prism I showed you before. This is a translation of it. Look at the way this is written. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. That's the first city. Appears to be historically accurate here. In Eridu, Alamum, almost sounds like Adam, you wonder, became king, and he reigned for 28,800 years. Is anything fishy here? Yeah, probably. All these are huge numbers for all the things, and this takes us up to 5 cities. 8 kings ruled over 385,200 years. He can't do his addition. You go and check it, you find he's way off. Then the flood swept over. The flood is historic. It's in the Sumerian Kings List, and it's in several other places. And we know when it was. We just can't get anything out of these numbers that makes sense to us. Next slide, please. Now, we've got all these symbols, and it turns out they're all multiples almost all of them are multiples of this symbol, and some of them are fractions, possibly multiples of this symbol here. Next slide, please. It turns out that the number 3,600, this symbol here, looks very much like the symbol for year. And we're starting to suspect a translation error when this thing was translated from Sumerian to Akkadian or something along the line. Next slide, please. But a day is 360th of a year according to the Mesopotamian calendar. So you start wondering if there isn't another translation glitch there somewhere. They're thinking it's 3,600, but really there ought to be a symbol for 360. Maybe it's 360, 60, or maybe instead of starting 1, 10, 60, it's 1, 6, 60, 100, 360. Maybe it goes this way. Instead of alternating 10, factor 6, factor 10, factor 6, maybe it starts with 6. And there was some translation error. Next slide, please. They use a 6-hour day in Sumerian literature. They speak of 2-hour periods. You read something that's been translated, it says, and he walked for 3 2-hour periods. What they mean is 3 of what they would have called an hour. Next, which would mean they have a base 6 day, suggesting 6 for the first step here. And also suggesting that the word year was a 360. Next slide, please. That 1,800 years just changed to 5 years if we make that correction. And these all look, with that correction, looks like a fairly reasonable length for king's ruling, especially considering how wild everyone was back at this time and likely to kill each other. Next slide. Now we look at the Genesis 5, and we don't see the same problem. If there's a translation error, that's not it. The pattern doesn't show up anywhere. Next slide, please. But there is something here that I thought was very interesting. We got long ages and short ages, pretty much, at a line right about here. These seem to all be shorter than those, so there's something else going on. But at least let's try this course division first. Next slide. About the time of Peleg. Unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the first was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. I don't mind going to Ken Ham and asking what that's about. He'll probably tell you that was when, well, he'll probably tell you the continents split then, but he might also say that the languages of the earth were scrambled at that point. The whole earth was of one language. Now that is turns out to be a historically true statement. Sumerian literature refers back to a time when all praised Enlil in the same tongue, Enlil being their head god, and kind of lamenting for the good old days. So God says, let us go down and confound their languages. Next slide. So they go to this plain in Shinar. Shinar's Babylon. And this line in green here, they had brick for stone and slime they had for mortar. Doesn't jump out and sound too strange to us, but it will in a little bit. We're going to come back to it. Let us build a tower whose top may reach unto the heaven. Stone and slime, and that's Babylon. They're next to Babylon. Next slide. Now, this is the ziggurat in Ur, which is a tower that they used for a temple. And this is a record. It's on a stone stele there. This is an artist's reconstruction of what you can barely see there. There's Nebuchadnezzar. And here's what it says in cuneiform. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. The ziggurat, Babel, the house. The foundations of heaven and earth. Ziggurat in Babylon. There he is again. I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to the heaven and made doors for the gates, and I covered it with bricks, or bitumen and bricks. Same kind of tower. They had these in every city in ancient Sumer. And this is what they looked like. They were towers to reach to the heavens. It said heavens up here somewhere. There it is. And they tried to make them waterproof so the flood wouldn't get them, because they know a flood's coming for some reason. Okay, this is a rebuilding of the tower in Babylon. The original would have been the Tower of Babel. Next slide, please. So where are we? They confound the languages, and if we're right about it being Peleg, as Ken Ham would assure us we are, that's when the languages are messed up. We've got long dates in front of it and short dates behind it. The Bible tells us that some of those poor folks got their language messed up and they couldn't talk to each other. Did any of us ever consider that we're also in that boat, that we got our languages messed up and we can't read our history? It says that in the Bible. Did we somehow smugly assume we escaped Babel unscathed? I think we have a translation error. You look at next slide maybe. You look at this thing, and you know there was a translation error there. And right about the same place, it turns out this is all before the flood, which is also before Babel. You take it down after the flood, there's more. Their languages straighten up a few generations afterward. Same place, same problem. Next slide. Okay, we've got an answer, but let's look at these guys here. Now, for some reason, next slide here, I think, yeah. They're not long, like they ought to be. Somehow, for some reason, they've been cut off at this point where the blue arrow is. Now, I'm going to, if there's something wrong here, and these were really mistranslations, I can't really go down here and see what would have been happening at the same time to see why they all died right then. But I can go down there and find out where there might have been a mistranslation or somebody going back and redacting or editing the text. So let's take a look down here. We're going to skip over some interesting stuff. We, for example, skipped over Noah's flood, which is fascinating, but if I have time, I'll get back to it. Jacob, Levi. Levi was, of course, Joseph's brother. Let's head down here and take a look at Joseph. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide again. Same deal. Joseph goes before Pharaoh. There's none so discreet and wise as thou, says Pharaoh. Unto thy word shall my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Joseph is a big man in Egypt. We ought to be able to see him in Egyptian history. He's number 2 in command under Pharaoh. There's nobody else. And he's also a very wise man. There's something special about Joseph. He's interpreting dreams and things. Next slide, please. So, the first to be second in command under Pharaoh, Djoser, that's the first time there was a second in command, was, third dynasty old kingdom, was Imhotep. The guy who's more famous than Pharaoh Djoser because they made silly monster movies out of him, Imhotep. Okay? But this is the guy we'd look for if we wanted to find Joseph, because it sounded like a new office, that nobody had ever been second in command, and this would be the first guy. Let's take a look at Imhotep. Next slide. First to be second in command under Pharaoh Djoser, old kingdom only. These are statues of him. He was deified. He actually became a god later in Egyptian mythology. Evidence of literacy. It's the first historic evidence of literacy. That's Djoser there. Next slide, please. Imhotep is how the books tell you you're supposed to pronounce it, but the movie says Imhotep, and we'll all go with the movie. He's the first to have the Pharaoh's full authority, first to build completely stone buildings, built the first pyramid, the step pyramid for Djoser's tomb. Under Imhotep, extreme wealth came to the pharaohs. First evidence of literacy, known for proverbs and wisdom, was considered the father of medicine, and the first commoner to be a god. Next slide. Imhotep doesn't sound like Joseph, but let me tell you a little make-believe story here and see how it sounds to you. Pharaoh says, here's this kid, he's just been dragged out of prison, he probably stinks. What's your name, kid? Yosef. Now, why do you say Yosef instead of Joseph? Any guesses? What's the Hebrew letter for J? There isn't one. Closest they come is a yod for Yosef, okay? The P and the PH are the same for the ending. It could have been Yosef or Yosep. Yo. Anyway, it's something, and it probably sounded very Jewish. So we don't have it right. We've messed up his name in English already. We know that. He says Yosef. Pharaoh says Hotep. Now, why would Pharaoh say that? First of all, he's my age and is a little hard of hearing. Second of all, Hotep is a common Egyptian name, means peace. And Yosef is some strange foreign name that he just couldn't even hear, kind of like Sinwei, my friend's wife from China. Okay, Joseph says, no, Yosef, and he emphasizes the ye right there, trying to get Pharaoh to straighten out a little bit, though he's a little nervous. He emphasizes the first sound, which happens to be the Egyptian word for come. So he says, come Hotep. It's what here. So you come in peace, Pharaoh says. Oh, no. All the courtiers laugh at Pharaoh's joke, Imhotep, come in peace. We stuck in an L there between the reed and the ceremonial loaf on the mat, if you're thinking in hieroglyphs instead of English. Joseph, starting to worry. Everybody's laughing. Yes, he knows he's missing something, but he's trying to be polite and afraid to contradict the Pharaoh again. And does that mean his name's now Imhotep? Fantasy, I made it up. Next slide. Okay, this is a base. There's Pharaoh Djoser's feet there. The rest of him is missing. There's another picture if you want to see what he really looked like. I hope he didn't look like that. That is an early cartouche before they did loops around them. Netter what? I can't read the last thing. I think it's cut or something like that. Djoser's Horus name, that indicates his name's Horus. This says the B over the loaf means that he's king of Lower Egypt. There's some kid over here that doesn't get as big a symbol, but he apparently has Pharaoh's seal. He's over the lower kingdom and the upper kingdom, the Nile reed and the bread. He's priest of Heliopolis. It says a lot of other things about him. His name is Yemi-Hotep. And look at the feet under the Nile reed there. That means this is a verb. It's not a letter Y, it's a verb, come. That's a generic preposition, can mean in, come in peace. Hotep. That's Imhotep's name, and it's actually come in peace, not Yemi-Hotep. So it's like a title, and we're dealing with the difference between Hotep and Yosef at this point. Okay, next slide. Joseph, so a bunch of stuff about Joseph. You can find those in the Bible. He saves Egypt from a 7-year famine. Let's go on to the next slide. Take these one at a time. He's sold into slavery by his brother's household slave of Potiphar. Let's check Imhotep out. Next slide. No record of his birth or childhood. He's certainly not royal. He was considered to be the son of the god Ptah, or Ptah, however you pronounce that in ancient, well, it would be Coptic, is as close as we can get in modern. However, an architect from around 490 BC traced his ancestry through Imhotep to an architect named Canifer, and there's something wrong with the Ka, too. It's like a title or something. It's hyphenated in the hieroglyphs that identify. He takes it 23 generations back from 490 BC and says, I'm descended from Imhotep, the god, and his father was Canifer, which sounds a lot like Potiphar, actually, but we're dealing with ancient records and a lot of stuff we don't understand. Next slide here. Not a very good match. Rose one day from prisoner to second under command. Next slide. Rose very quickly to second in command under Joseph. There's no evidence of him before having this high position. Next slide. Saved Egypt from a 7-year famine by interpreting Pharaoh's dream. Now, how are we going to find that? Next slide, please. The famine stele on the island of Sihil, at the first cataract of the Nile, tells about Imhotep and how he saved Egypt from a 7-year famine by advising Pharaoh. After being advised, Pharaoh had a dream about the solution. As a result, a 10% tax was imposed. So it says 1/5 in Genesis. So it's obviously not the same guy, right? We got an error there. It's a historic fact that Joseph's reign was when pharaohs first became wealthy enough to build pyramids. No huge burial monuments before Joseph. For the whole kingdom, the whole old kingdom following Imhotep and Joseph, they all had huge pyramids. Somehow they started getting money at this point. Next slide. Now, why don't we hear about this in history classes? It's because the famine stele is a Ptolemaic forgery. It was carved by the priests of Kun over 1,000 years later to say, and now we're the guys who should be getting all the money. Now, here's a forgery. You recognize the face on it there. This is not an authentic dollar bill. Well, that's actually a picture of an authentic dollar bill there. It's still not an authentic dollar bill. But if you look at the two and compare them, you'll find they're as much alike as can possibly be and still get Homer Simpson's mug there, right? The reason is, if you want anyone to look at that and say, oh, that's a dollar bill, you have to follow the rules. Same deal with the priests of Kun. They couldn't write anything they wanted to. They had to follow the rules. There were lots of historic accounts, including Manthos, which was lost except for fragments in Josephus, probably in the Library of Alexandria when it burned down. But it's probable that this was as authentic as the forgers could make it. Next slide, please. Mary's the daughter of the priest of Heliopolis. Next slide. Imhotep is the priest of Heliopolis. Or becomes it. Heliopolis is Greek for On, which is the biblical name for the place. Now, we don't know if priest was a hereditary office or not. But if it was hereditary, or even if it wasn't, Joseph's all set up. He's married to the daughter of the priest. And when the priest dies, who are they going to look for? Well, Joseph's a great candidate. He's second in command under Egypt. They can get some power for this priesthood if they pick him. Imhotep's right where Joseph probably would have been. Next slide. His family, Abraham, emigrated from Iraq to Egypt. And of course, the step pyramids were all over the place in Iraq. Next slide. Imhotep, I said Imhotep, I meant Joseph, right? I get confused here. Designed the first step pyramid, very similar to the towers and temples in Iraq. They look like this. Here's the first step pyramid, the one designed by Imhotep for Joseph. Do you see any similarity there? So nobody's ever built a pyramid before, and for some reason they look just like the Iraqi ziggurats made out of fire brick and slime. Next slide, please. He lived about 12 generations after Noah. If you count generations in the genealogies, it's 12 in the Masoretic text, 13 in the Septuagint. About 12. Next slide. There's the generations, we could count them. He lived about 250 years after the Mesopotamian deluge, which was, of course, mythical and a freshwater flood. You can find both of those, sometimes both in the same book of the secular historians. They're so angry that they can't realize they're contradicting themselves when they say that it was a freshwater flood and it was mythical. Using the Egyptian and Mesopotamian chronologies, we get 250 years to separate those generations. You do a division, you get about 21 years per generation, which is at least a reasonable number. Whether or not it's the truth is a whole different issue. Next slide, please. He lived to be 110 years old. That's a pretty old age. Next slide, please. Imhotep serves under 3 pharaohs after Djoser, and they're the years he serves under each one. So, depending on what time, whether it was the latter end or the beginning, he's got to build this pyramid for Djoser during Djoser's lifetime. So it's probably closer to the 55 years he's serving. He's not a baby when he starts, so add another 20 years to that, maybe 75 years. And he probably lived many years after this. And if we're working backwards, we would say it's very likely. We've got a very old man here. History considers him to be strikingly old. Next slide. Joseph's bones were carried out of Egypt. Next slide. Imhotep's tomb has never been found. Now, this would not be particularly remarkable, except finding the tomb of the patron of writing is expected to be well worth the effort. And they've been turning the place upside down looking for Imhotep's tomb, and they haven't found it. Next slide. Okay, who is this guy? He's actually considered history's first genius. I said first evidence of writing. Next slide. This is a stele featuring Menes here. He's the pharaoh that united northern and southern Egypt. You can tell by the crowns he's wearing there. There he is vanquishing. That's an early picture of a scepter, and you can see what they're really for historically, vanquishing an enemy there. And this is writing from before then. It's just pictures. There's no sentence structure, no anything. Here's how many enemy we killed. Headless figures there. Okay, next slide. And immediately after Imhotep, we end up with stuff like this. This is a row of cartouches. It's cellular. It's a hybrid syllabary. There's 3 kinds of symbols here. We have the phonetic spelling of the pharaoh's name here. We have a symbol here that means this is a pharaoh we're talking about. We have a symbol here which means the kind of fellow this was. Oh, let's see. The Northern Kingdom, there's the guy that was Northern Kingdom ruler. It's a symbol that means the whole thing. There's different kinds of symbols. It's called syllabary, meaning each of these symbols here are phonetic representations of syllables. It's a cellular layout. You can see cells for each idea. And they had different ways of reading it, but usually it was top to down. Sometimes, well, the pictures would tell you which way to read it. You read from nose to tail of each critter, so you know how to read it like this. Usually it went from right to left, but sometimes they didn't want the critters facing away from a doorway, so on the other side they'd go left to right. If there was a pharaoh picture, they'd all face the pharaoh because it would be rude to turn your back on the pharaoh. But in general, it was top down anyway. Next slide. This is the stele of the vultures. It's Sumerian pictograph. Very simple. It's a hybrid syllabary. Some of the symbols mean something about the word. Some are phonetic. There's our food again, probably in barley. It looks a whole lot like the early hieroglyphs anyway, is the point I'm trying to make here. Next slide. So, it's an artist's depiction of Joseph and Imhotep. They look like the same historic critter to me. We're dealing with very old and fragmentary records, but we can find a lot that matches so closely that I think it's safe to say that Imhotep and Joseph were the same critter. And so I'm going to make that claim. Next slide. Okay, take another look at this. I still don't have any clue here, but there was a lot of translation messing around going on. Next slide. Joseph's writing in Egyptian, so we've got another numbering system. That's like a Roman numeral 1 for 1 and other different things for different numbers. Next slide. What if Genesis isn't the original version of Joseph's family history now instead of the Bible? Because he wouldn't think of it as the Bible, he would think of it as family history, but it's been edited. Let's consider the possibility that somebody might have edited it around Joseph's time. Next slide, please. For example, that may have cropped these things. Our Bible says he begat Arphaxad after he lived 500 years, after Shem lived 500 years. To get this length here, next slide, please. What if the Bible that Joseph was handed said 800 years there, something that was like this. Next slide, please. Then, down here, this is Joseph here, and he looks at this, and he says to himself, let's see, next slide maybe. No, back up one. I wasn't through with this first one. Can you back up, or is this... I've given you a hard job. Okay, it worked. Very good. So he looks at this, and he starts doing some math. After all, this guy's in charge of keeping track of the Pharaoh's records, and it's one of the things he would do. And he looks up here, and he says, so this guy lived so-and-so, gave birth, and then lived after he gave birth this many years. Wait a minute. I thought these guys all died at the end. What do they mean lived 800 years after? That guy dies in the future. Something's wrong. Hey, Dad. Calls his dad, and his dad's there in Egypt with him, and the dad says, no, he's dead. I can assure you. My grandpa Abraham said that. Next slide. That would have been, Grandpa Abraham. This is Jacob here, and this is Joseph. So that would have been Abraham there. He told me he was dead. So he had to die this time or before. So they've got to decide what to do. They know the dates are wrong. They know somebody's messed up. They don't know how. So they make a decision. Next slide. They pick a system for chopping them off and what they think is a reasonable way of doing it. So these guys are dead at this time. Next slide, please. Now this is scary. Could somebody have been monkeying with the text? Well, it turns out, remember this here? The line I warned you about in green there? It came to pass when they journeyed east and they started building this tower. Come, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and slime they had for mortar. Next slide. These guys don't know anything about building with stone. In fact, Joseph invents building with stone. That line, they had brick for stone and slime for mortar, is trying to explain something to the reader that somebody in Iraq wouldn't have understood. This is called a redaction. Somebody's added that later who thinks the normal way to build is with stone and mortar instead of brick and slime. Brick and slime. Okay, who would that be? Next slide here. This is Moses down here. If it had been as late as Moses, those guys all would have been dead and there wouldn't be any problem. So somewhere right in here, Joseph, and except that's Levi there actually, but Joseph would have been fairly contemporary. We only got a couple generations to work with there. Somebody in this range got bothered by that and made the edit. Next slide here. So maybe there's hope for sorting these out someday. I sure haven't come up with it yet. I've spent a lot of time trying to make sense out of them. Next slide. But I think we've lost those. I think they've been cropped and we can't even use the numbers anymore. The number to birth is probably legit. These numbers here are probably fictitious. That one looks suspiciously round to me, but so does this one here. 403, 403, 430. I don't know. Next slide. Here's some other examples of the text where it's obviously been modified. To this day, and to this day, and to this day. Somebody came along later and said, hey, that's still the same. Next slide. Or, which is Bethlehem. That one changed. Somebody had to come along and say, that one's different now. Before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. That one came much later. Somebody who knew about kings came and added that phrase to it. So we've got a lot of redactions in Genesis that we have to watch out for. Next slide. You can be an inerrantist and believe this because it's only the autographs we believe were inerrant. And as long as those autographs are inerrant, we know there was a scrambling of the language and somebody copied it. And apparently they copied it incorrectly. Now there's a question of what good it does to be an inerrantist. I'm an inerrantist. People ask me, well, so what? You don't believe anything. Well, actually I do. I believe the autographs were inerrant, but I don't trust all the translators and copiers. Too bad we don't have the original text. I could tell you what I believe. Zisedra, he's the Sumerian Noah. The Hebrew word for Noah is Nun Chich, and the vowels are anyone's guess. We call him Noah. Similar. Here's another name for Noah, Zisedra, Yimihotep, Yosef. I can't make any sense of it, but somebody called Noah this. Somebody says, build a giant something or other. There's a lot missing in this text because it's been all busted up. Humbly obedient, reverently. We got a guy here that's an obedient servant, tending constantly, bringing forth dreams, uttering something about listening through a wall in the Akkadian and Sumerian stories. Take my word, give ear to my instructions. A flood will sweep over the cult centers to destroy the seed of mankind. Next slide. Some more stuff from the Zisedra. Its kingship, its rule will be put to an end. There will be windstorms. Flood swept over after for 7 days. I think that's literal. Flood sweeps over after for 7 days and 7 nights. Flood had swept over the land. A huge boat had been tossed. At the end, Ziusudra opens the window of the huge boat, and the animals disembarked. It's obviously the story of Noah. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. Next slide. Utnapishtim. This is from the Gilgamesh epic, and there's lots of versions of this extant. It's in Akkadian. This is now we're Utnapishtim. We're not Ziusudra. We're not Noach or Noah or any of these other things. There was a city called Sharupik, the Sharupik flood. That was the king right before the flood swept over in the king's list. Might have been the last king on the list. Might have been Noah, according to the Ziusudra story. Into the ship bring the seed of all living creatures. We're picking up something from the Ziusudra seed of living animals we put in it. Next slide. Aes, one of the gods, ordered me to close the door. There's a door in this thing. The riverbanks failed to hold the water. And the seventh day, we got that word seventh day again. We got a dove and a swallow and a raven. Next slide. The Genesis flood. You've all read this over and over again. We got 3 chapters starting in 6. I'll destroy man. Noah found grace. Keep the seed alive. Yet 7 days, every living substance that I've made, I will destroy. It's the same story. Next slide. After 7 days, waters of flood were upon the earth. Fountains of the great deep were broken up. The Lord shut him in. There's the door again. A wind passed over the earth. Next slide. Noah opened the window of the ark. We still got that. There's the raven. Yet another 7 days, the dove. Yet other 7 days. Every beast went forth out of the ark. Same story. Now here's something else that's interesting about the story of Noah. Next slide here. The Genesis 1 account, and God created and the earth and darkness. God breathed, and God said, and God saw, and God divided. It's very repetitious. Seems to not deviate from this format. There was evening and morning. Day 1, of course, is repeated. Next slide. The Genesis flood has a bunch of phrases that sound like that. Next slide. They also have a bunch that start, and Noah did, and Noah went, and Noah was, etc. Next slide. And then there's somebody else that's just got a completely different style that keeps sticking his 2 cents in. And it came to pass. In the 600th year, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. Now, it's good this guy was here because he gives us a lot of detail, but he doesn't sound like the other guys. Next slide. If you read Noah's flood, thinking there might be different authors here, you'll notice some repetition. God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth. A few verses down. The earth was also corrupt before God. 13. The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. Sounds like he's telling us that for the first time. We knew that. Why is he saying it again? Why do you say it 3 times? Next slide. Thou shalt come into the ark. Come thou and all the house into the ark. Noah went in, and his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives with him, into the ark. Entered Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah and his wife, and 3 wives of his sons, into the ark. Have we heard it yet? Okay, next slide. The flood of waters was upon the earth. The waters of the flood were upon the earth. The flood was 40 days upon the earth. The waters prevailed upon the earth. Why does he have to tell us this so many times? Next slide. And the waters assuaged. The waters returned from off the earth. The waters were abated as the waters decreased continually. Do we see a pattern here? Next slide. The colophon. We finally get to the end of the count. Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah. Shem, Ham, Japheth, and maybe Noah. The text itself identifies this as being a composite of authors of 3 different writers here stuck together named Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The sons, and there's the sequencing. The Bible says we should expect to see what we're seeing here. Next slide. This is the stonemason who tried to track his genealogy to Imhotep, and we got 23 generations here. This is kind of interesting. Next slide, and you won't be able to see it. But I tried to do the same things with Luke and Matthew. From Darius somewhere down here, I figured it out at the time in counting the generations. It matches the pedigree of the stonemason. It doesn't match secular history. The generations are too long in secular history. They fit between the Bible and this guy writing in hieroglyphs on a quarry wall. Next slide, please. Eventually, dendrochronology, where they can take the wood out of the tombs and figure out which year each ring was put down in the artifacts, will straighten this out, but we're not there yet. We're as far as Turkey. We started in California, made it to the Black Forest in Germany. They just did it in Turkey. Watch and wait for that. And that's it for this talk. Thank you.